Hello, and welcome to the third ever event from the Alignist at the Green Space. I want to personally welcome you all here tonight. The Green Space has been a wonderful host and collaborator for these events, and I just want to tell you a little bit more about the Alignist, what it does, kind of how this event fits into the picture. So the Alignist is a venture that I started. It's a box subscription company, and each box unpacks a big real world issue. So it takes something like the pollution and human toll of oil extraction in Nigeria, or the rise of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or human trafficking in Mexico. And it connects those stories through a novel to what's actually happening, so that you can get a little bit of a sense of the reality behind the plot. And that happens through these companion readers that I create, that as you're flipping through the novel and you get to a point in the novel where you see something that you might not be familiar with, they allow you to have a moment of connection. So for example, this evening's event is based on Afghanistan, following a box that is curated and connects to the story of Afghanistan, all based on a novel by Nadia Hashimi, who you'll hear from in a little bit. The novel is called A House Without Windows. And as you're reading through that novel, you'll get to a moment when she mentions Queen Soraya, who was a queen in Afghanistan in the 1920s. And there was this moment, as you read in the roadmap, that you'll learn about when she tore off her hijab in public, which was this major moment and turning point in Afghan history that actually led in part to her and her husband's overthrow. So you're reading along and you hear mention of this name, you're enjoying the story, and instead of turning to Wikipedia to find out who this person is, you have this moment of connection. Now, each box also includes a series of items that give you a sense of the culture of the place that you're reading about. So these items include authentic recipes, fair trade crafts, and also some artisan ingredients. And one of the ones that I wanted to share with you tonight from this box is this, which I've had to rubber band so it doesn't perfume my whole bag, but it smells lovely. And what it is this piquant spice. And it's made by this company called Rumi Spice, which is run by US Army veterans who served in Afghanistan and want to give back to the country in a positive way. And so they partner with the saffron farmers and use this ethical supply model so that those farmers can have a sustainable living. So each box allows you to give back to the country that you're learning about through this fair trade model. And so you can find those boxes outside, and how this event connects with the boxes is that it's a way to unpack further what happens in the boxes. So it brings the stories that you read about, some of the culture that you are learning about, and some of the flavors of that country to life right here on stage. Because, we're approaching now, for this event in specific, I'm gonna have to put the spice down before I perfume this whole room. Okay, so it's been nearly 20 years since the war in Afghanistan began, since the US-led invasion. 20 years. And how many horrific headlines have we seen since then? And how often do we get to hear people from Afghanistan share their own stories? How often do we get to understand their art and their expression and celebrate the successes that people from Afghanistan have had against impossible odds? This is an evening that lets you do all of that. And I want to kick it off for you with the author of our featured novel, Nadia Hashimi. It gives me great pleasure to introduce her. She is a woman out to change the world. So Nadia is a pediatrician, a mother of 4, and she ran for Congress in 2018. So she also just happens to be a best-selling novelist a few times over. So I'm really excited to announce that Nadia is here with us. She is the author of A House Without Windows, including other books, but A House Without Windows is her book that was featured in our last box. So Nadia, welcome to the Green Space. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
It's amazing to be here. Hi, everyone.
So I want to just start by talking a little bit about your backstory and how you kind of came up in the U.S. but were really immersed in Afghan culture. So what was it? I know that this book was, or that you didn't visit Afghanistan until much later on in your life, not as a child. And so what was it like for you to visit, and was it like what you imagined it would be?
Okay, so you're right. I was born and raised in the United States, and actually New York is my home state, although I did live in New Jersey for a little bit. So for me, I feel like, and I think this happens when you grow up in the first generation or that immigrant household, I always felt like I grew up with a very spiritual connection to Afghanistan, to the culture, because I was growing up in it. I was living it, breathing it in our home. We were speaking it, eating it, celebrating it, and yet not having that physical or that geographical connection to the country. And I was also a person, I've always been a person who loves to travel. And so I had a lot of stamps in my passport, and I kept that with a lot of pride. And that was, Afghanistan was like that one place that I couldn't go to. And so it was sort of this aspiration of mine to be able to actually step foot in that country. My parents had left in the early part of the 70s, so they also hadn't been back in my entire lifetime. And in 2003, it was like, well, we can go now. We could actually go now. So I told my parents, I said, listen, I'm going, and what do you guys think? They decided they wanted to go too. They hadn't been. Obviously, this was their homeland. This is where they'd grown up. And what had we been doing this entire time but sitting at home, watching on the news, reading in newspapers all that had been happening and hearing from relatives. And, I grew up in the age of like those really like thin blue paper airgram letters that used to come in the mail. So we went from that to like the age of the internet, where there was a flood of information, but all of this kind of like from afar. So we took a trip there in 2003. I felt like I was having two experiences there. One was mine, but then also watching my parents' experience. For them, I was watching them kind of step into a country that at times was homeland, and then at times they felt very out of place because so much had changed. The land had changed, and they had changed. For me, it was kind of like stepping into that thing that had been in my head for a really long time, stepping into that place where finally everybody speaks, or a lot of people speak that language, that I've been hearing at home that other people in our neighborhood didn't speak. It was, seeing things on the street and everything that looked like, the stuff that we can sometimes find somewhere in New York, but it's all there. So meeting family members, I'll tell you one story is that I went to a relative's home, and in their home, which had been damaged by the war, there was this big trunk. And we got to go through the trunk because it was my mom's cousin living in the home then. And he said, I think there's some of your stuff there, that other relatives had left behind. And I opened the trunk, and in it was like my second grade picture, with the student picture with like the lasers in the background and stuff, But this was, stuff that my mom had sent back to her family over the years. And it's like, it's here. So there was a part of me there always. And it was really powerful to make that connection.
Yeah. And I feel like I can sense that in your writing, because so much of fiction is reality butting up against the imagination. And I love how that happens in this novel, A House Without Windows, because you take us into a world that few have seen, right? It's set primarily in a women's prison. And I want you to talk to us a little bit about how you came upon that setting, how you kind of what you imagined and what you filled in through, any experiences that you had, any research that you did. What was the process like to kind of come into that space to write this book?
Yeah, this book was, I think all of my books come from a place of outrage and frustration. Sometimes it's like my therapy. If I'm really upset about something, I'm like, well, I'll write a story about it, right? And I remember reading an article or coming across something where it talked about these women in Afghanistan who were imprisoned for crimes of morality or crimes of the heart, a girl falling in love with someone and her family disapproving, or a young woman being, pregnant out of wedlock, and these kinds of situations. And it wasn't just that, though. It was also the concept that what happened in the women's prison was that they built a sense of community, that there were sisterhoods, and that for some of the women, compared to what was happening back at home, the prison actually offered a bit of respite, and it was almost like a safe haven. And how crazy was that? And so it's out of that, that concept that I decided, let me craft a story. The research part of any novel, I think, is really intriguing. It's also it's like a warren of rabbit holes that you can end up going down and never surfacing sometimes. So you sometimes forget to kind of come back and write the book.
Yeah.
But it was really intriguing to dig into pictures. There are photographers that have done some amazing work. And sometimes I would sit with the pictures and just look at them, and you have to try to, and I've done this with some other stories too, where you have to kind of step into the photographs and, imagine what it would be like to touch the walls. What might it smell like? Where does the light come through? Just to be able to imagine what that character might be feeling sitting in that room or sitting in that space. I've also worked with, there's a woman named Heather Barr, who's an attorney. She works for Human Rights Watch, and she spent a lot of time going through Afghanistan and specifically touring through the women's prisons and writing a very detailed report, interviewing a lot of women. And so I relied heavily on the work that she had put together. And then she actually read my draft for me and was like, no, that room has a door on this side. And she was so meticulous about helping me to kind of nail down. And it was important for me to be as authentic as possible, because there's a bit of responsibility that comes with writing, from afar about an issue that is something that I felt like needed attention and, and warranted a real conversation.
Right, and it's so there's so many rich stories here. There's so much great texture, and it feels almost like at times some of them are too hard to believe, and then you go back to some of the reality, and it's like, no, this is maybe even dulled down from what the reality is like in some aspects.
Yeah, there's almost no limit to how strange this world can be, and so when we, that saying that we have, that truth is stranger than fiction. It is true. And I am not someone who I feel like has a very wide and expansive imagination. I take a lot from the reality of what's happening around the world, and specifically in Afghanistan. And, the things that are happening in our world are wild.
I thought that when I came across what I mentioned, the story of Queen Soraya, I was just so moved by that, because I think she's someone who, I had never heard of before, and I think many people probably hadn't, and yet she is this exemplar of the kind of change that, part of this war's mission was to bring, is change for women, and she was that person in so many ways. So I wanted to ask you kind of how she disrupts this idea, and how you came across other women who disrupted this idea of what we traditionally think of the role of women being in Afghanistan.
I've actually been thinking very recently about that particular scene, about that moment where Queen Soraya kind of rips off her headscarf, and it's such a visible, action to take, right? Because it's literally that thing that's covered where, people have really connected the headscarf or the hijab with a symbol of oppression, and that's a whole other discussion for a whole other day, right? But in that particular moment, for this woman, for this queen to stand up and do this, it was a sign of, a liberation, of taking the next step and sort of elevating the role of women more into the public sphere and taking them away from being second-class citizens and lifting them up to be on par with their male counterparts. And it just occurred to me, because I saw a clip the other day and I grew up kind of watching old school TV, but Mary Tyler Moore. And the Mary Tyler Moore intro, and that theme song where she kind of steps into the street and then takes off her hat and like whips it into the air. And I thought, it's sort of a symbolic moment for Mary Tyler Moore too. And so I think there are characters in all countries that are running these parallel courses where they're standing up and saying, this is a different time. And women are now going to step out of, whatever construct has been created for them and challenge the status quo and enter new roles. And I think Queen Soraya did it, where she became a more visible person, a more formidable person who actually had a role in that society, as opposed to just being, the person standing next to the actual leader of the country. And women across the country here are doing the same thing too, where we're really stepping into the public sphere, having agency, and owning, our part in guiding where the future is going to go.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about that. And really, my question is like, what is your secret? Because of all of the many things you do in this time, we still talk about how women can't have it all. You have done so many things. And so I wanted to ask you kind of how you manage your various roles and kind of what made you want to step up and seek political office.
So, I think I've been really fortunate that I have an incredibly supportive family. My husband's really, really supportive of everything that I want to do. And my parents and my extended family, my in-laws, everyone's been really, really supportive. It is very hard to do a bit of everything. And I make no mistake about that. It's tough. And sometimes we feel like we're stretched and we're kind of in different places. But I think we all, men, women, we all have whatever we decide for our family life, and then there's sort of our work life beyond that. And I decided that I wanted to do certain things that pushed my boundaries, but all of it, the one thread that kind of runs through everything I've done is taking a look at how the world around us impacts the lives of the people, that I'm dealing with. So when I was working in an emergency room as a pediatrician, I'd step in there and, if a teenage girl's coming in with abdominal pain, I have to figure out also, who's at home with her, what's going on in her life, what could this be? And so any medical condition is going to involve, home finances, the politics of the region, so everything. Same thing happens in a story. I don't have a character floating in space. I have characters that are tied to communities, that are tied to local politics, to international politics. And, same thing with me. I'm living in a world where I am tied to all these things, right? And so what's happening in our country affected me, affected my children. And when I look at healthcare in our region, that was really what was pushing me to step up and say, we need people who actually have experience on the front lines to step up and talk about where the challenges are and hopefully find some solutions for it.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to talk about, but then to actually live it is, I'm sure, a very different experience to put yourself out there in that way. It's interesting how it connects to writing. And we'll have you on to answer some more questions. But thank you so much for this moment and this conversation and for the book, A House Without Windows. It's a really wonderful read. If you haven't read it, you should definitely check it out. So thank you so much, Nadia.
Thank you.
And poetry, it comes up a lot in your novel, and it's such a major artistic tradition in Afghanistan. And so in this evening of celebrating the culture of this country, we really didn't think it could be complete without poetry. And so we wanted to also invite an Afghan poet to join us. Her name is Zohra Saed, and she will share some of her work. Okay. Yeah, there she is. So Zohra Saed is a poet and a professor of literature at Bard Early College. She's also the co-editor of One Story, 30 Stories, an anthology of contemporary Afghan American literature, and she's the co-founder of Upset Press, a Brooklyn-based nonprofit indie press. So thank you, Zohra, for joining us, and we're so excited to hear some of your work.
Thanks. Hi. Okay, let's do this without breaking the mic. The poems I write are mostly about Afghan cities, so we'll start there. Jalalabad will never be Jaybad. Jalalabad, once Adinapur, is a mythic city of shine, the whim of a Mughal king, Jalaluddin Akbar, known for his fondness for citrus and fountains. Akbar became a cane in the city of citrus, a long leaf of green from which a garden sprouted. Jalalabad nurtures fresh springs in her navel. At night, a pari appears and wraps her wings around the city. If you press against a wall here, it will turn to water. If you dig your face into the earth, the carpet of grass will erase the bombs. Herat. Herat is a misspelled heart, a constellation of golden tiles, and the ever-competitive molten blue domes. If you suddenly become poor in Herat, the folk cure for this affliction is to bite the air. In the bleeding and biting of air, you'll find at your feet a small puddle of rubies. Emily would have had a better home here, far from Amherst, frolicking with sisters who also glitter their eyes with words. The moon eats Alexander's city in Takhar, Afghanistan. This is a ruin of an ancient city. Alexandria on the Oxus, Yani meaning Sikandaria on the Amu Darya, is eaten by the graceful alligator in the river, the one with her eyelids painted gold. Mark the crescent and the star in the sky, and her chariot near with twin lion-headed horses. A river of gold undulates like the bowed heads of an army, all for Ay Khanum. This is her medallion. Alexander's city is swallowed whole by Ay Khanum, Moon Khan, Yani meaning moon queen, moon lady, lady of the crescent moon and the star and of the heavenly water. Yani meaning in the land of the moon and the star, Ay Khanum swept Alexandria under her skirt. Khalas, finished. Just like Jalalabad. The American that went to Jalalabad wrote, "It looks just like New Jersey." What would he have thought of Afghans in Parsippany? This was 1922, when there was no Cold War to boil Afghanistan down to the bones, so there were no Afghans in Parsippany yet. But I think he needed to meet some Afghans, Jersey Afghans, to see if they agreed with him. In Jersey, my dad sat by a small waterfall and said, once there was a man in Safed Koh who was so powerful in faith that he turned the waterfall back upwards just with the utterance of a prayer. Now Kiran, my journalist friend, tells me when she was in Safed Koh that it's not a place for mountainside picnics. The mountains are for bunkers, weapons, the falling teeth of warplanes. She sent me photos of checkpoints from her phone. But I'm still thinking about my father's story of my grandfather by the waterfall in Safed Koh. So I say, see, it is a bewitched place. There is a spell, a talisman, to keep people from reaching it. She shakes her head no and tells me, you need to go see for yourself in New Jersey. Kandahar. Behave or the sleeping Alexander will reclaim your lungs. Kandahar, once a cube of sugar, refused to dissolve in the sea and became a city from sheer stubbornness. Alexander's hubris made the earth giggle and birth him a full-grown woman, Roxana, Roxanne, if you prefer. His wife refused to dissolve in his sea. Afghans know how the bright sun found him the next day, yellow cheeks pressed against a poisoned pillow embroidered by Roxana. The pillow and 3 drops of blood are still preserved by the mountains. They wait for an audience to confess that this place revenged itself on a naive Macedonian. Alexander conquered by the mountain's daughter. Kandahar could never return as Alexandria after that delicious murder. And I think I'll end off with this one. Sister of my spine, wearing war behind one ear. Twin aunts, once known to me only as calligraphy on rose-printed paper, reach us. For years, I traced their voices, arranged the lilt of their voice on the kitchen counters next to unripe fruit, waiting. Suddenly, they are here, alive, not phantoms, stretched by long-distance calls. My aunts take sweets one after the other, daintily raise teacups to their mouths, welcoming the coil of steam. Twin aunts roll their sleeves, turn up the flat belly of their arms, and ask me to witness. Dolphin skin, small linking lakes, pale as amber. I read signs in their burned scars, as clearly as tea leaves in a bone china cup. Tell me again the story of your escape. Tell me how you fled. We were 16 then. Who'll ever marry us like this? Awkward laughter slips from their mouths. I'm 16 now. My mouth a navel. Look how you've grown. Do you remember your cousin? The coy aunt tugs at the bold one's elbow. Maybe you shouldn't ask. Do you remember? A neon sound, an accusation. Now I, the sorry storyteller, use the dull knife of Farsi as precisely as a thumb. The bomb blast, the trilling in my ears, the wall of the seamstress's shop, the burnt and torn flower print skirt, the smooth ankle, the color of wheat. Her toes painted red, polka dots made with a toothpick dipped in white nail polish. I hold both bottles, red and white, blow on her toes. The tender touch to be sure it's dry, the smile of red on my fingertip. The pavement drank her whole, say the men who come for survivors. For a few breaths, I am still lost. Their fatherly scent, their anise scent, near, then the deafening cheer for the saved little girl. I am saved only after falling into a garbage can. No, I don't remember. I say instead, giving them the bald of my eyes. They give me more stories, warm non and cool stream stories, mountains like mother stories, to make amends for the war, still clinging to the hem of their skirts. Cool palms smooth my forehead, then they turn over my emptied cup and read the tea leaves. I watch their hands flutter to their lips, Uzbek and Farsi like snow, melting just at the rim of my cup. We have come with empty hands. We fled with only our lives.
Thank you so much for that reading. I feel like you made good on the title of this event, Ticket to Afghanistan, by giving us just a full tour. So I wanted to just start there and ask you a little bit about maybe just those poems that are in reference to or maybe homage to these cities. What was your process like to write them, and why did you want to share maybe some different scenes of those cities than we would get otherwise?
Well, it all really started with the word Jabad, or Jabad, and I was really disturbed that the place where I was born in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, that it was turned into a completely foreign place than what I had grown up. I left as a child, as an infant. So for me, the stories of Afghanistan come from the oral tradition. My father had stories stored from his father, his grandfather, and then an elder storyteller who was in Safed Ko, actually. So these were all fairy tales I grew up on, stories of cities, and then historical research I was doing. When I did my PhD, my first work was on more colonial writings, travel narratives, and early American writings in Central Asia. So I found all these misspelled ways of writing Afghanistan, and some sounded actually closer phonetically to how we pronounce it, and some very, very far. So in that search and that scholarly research that I was doing, I ended up writing all this and responding to the kind of idea we have of Afghanistan. And just to know that it's about 5,000 years old. Afghanistan was the place where Babylonian queens were getting their lapis lazuli, and ancient Egypt was getting their work. And the teaching I do actually informs a lot of my writing. I teach from ancient to medieval literature in this really great program, and that movement, that ancient world, is very much connected to Afghanistan. That's why we have the city of Oy Khanum, the defiant female presence in these stories. So,
Yeah, and I would love to ask you more about that. I found your mentioning of oral traditions so interesting because poetry has such a rich tradition in Afghanistan where people, I've heard just recite couplets at moments for whatever moment's need arises. And I just wanted you to tell us a little bit about the relationship that Afghan people have to poetry, how it's kind of a lived thing, and maybe especially so for women. And you can jump in as well, Nadia.
Sure. Well, I think that one of the most important texts was Sadi's Rose Garden. The Sadi and the Quran are read at once. So this idea that Afghan women were always illiterate and need to be sort of educated is quite different than the scene itself. So there is the memorization of prayers, there is a recitation and the writing of prayers, I say. Prayers also influence the rhythm and musicality of the poetry, I would say. But the Landé version, the couplet version, the Charbaiti, the 4-line version, there is a long history of Afghan women publishing and writing poetry, as well as reciting it and having it be part of like oral games and playfulness, part of celebrations. I do want to name some, like Rabia Balkhi from the 10th century, Aisha Durrani, During the time of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, she published her first book in the lithograph press that Amir Abdurrahman Khan had, and then the later Afghan women who published their writing. And some are pen names that they published under, like the Veiled One or the Hidden One, but for the most part, there was a strong literary community. Then there is the playful one that can, in the kitchen, at least how I grew up, in the kitchen, kind of compose combating battle poems. And that's what me and Sahar Muradi, a poet friend, did for 3 years. In the summers, we had poetry battles as a way to resurrect that game playing of poetry. So,
yeah, there's this, I mean, that's such a wonderful kind of detail that I feel like we don't necessarily hear about in our understanding. And there's it reminds me of the scene from A House Without Windows when the women inside of this prison are kind of coming up with couplets responding to one another and kind of describing their deep inner states, but through these kind of playful couplets. So I don't know if there's something you want to...
And I think the rich history that we have, the legacy that Zohra's been speaking of is one that I think was really important to relate to the readers. And so that's why I do in each of my books, I go back and I pull from the poetry. In one book, it's the poetry of my great-grandfather, and others it might be, Rabia Bakhi or other women or other poets from the country's history, because I think it is important to note that does exist. And in House Without Windows, I used the Lende couplets, bless you, because I really wanted to integrate, the ways that women spoke, the ways they expressed what was in their heart. And these couplets are fun. Sometimes they're racy, sometimes they're political. And so I had a lot of fun kind of recreating what they might say in this particular situation when they're talking about, women's honor and being in prison and what led them to be there. And so, one of my favorites that I get to use once in a while, because the topic still comes up, even here in the United States, is I had one of the characters say, if a man's honor is his highest prize, why does he hide it between a woman's thighs? And that's a lot bolder than anything that I personally would have ever said in my life, in my household, in front of my parents. But the beauty of stepping into a character is that I get to be that, like, a bit more raunchy Afghan woman, because they exist, I mean, we've got some in my family. But being able to, showcase that the diversity in the ways that Afghan women express themselves, we have visual artists, we have literary artists, and not all of them have their name in textbooks, and yet they exist, and that legacy kind of comes through the next generation.
And it's also interesting to translate some of that into English, as you both are doing. Mm-hmm. So is that kind of a process to you to maybe think about it in an original, another language, or has it become quite seamless to code switch that way?
It's definitely something that I can do in dialogue with, especially my father, who's always been very open-minded about these things, always, even in Afghanistan. So I think that, and it's not really about being open-minded. I think it's just about being literary and part of that community. So for me, it's having that dialogue back and forth and the discussion of words and finding in English the kind of rhythm and music that's in Persian poetry, and then the heaviness of ornamental language that may not translate over in English. And that's why we see some translations of Persian poetry that seems a little sort of too heavy on the floral parts, but there has to be a way of sort of bring that negotiation happens, and that's why I couldn't even bring one of my recent translations in. Yeah, I needed to sort of get the English language to bend into the Farsi, so that could be a challenge.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear you read, because your work sounded to me very nostalgic almost, and you mentioned that you left Afghanistan when you were an infant, and yet there is a real kind of sweetness and longing in that nostalgia. Can you tell me a little bit about what it's like to write kind of from a point of departure? What is that process like for you? What does that feel like?
That's good. I think in many ways, my father has been my country too, right? And that family relation is really important to me. Our family, because we were in Jalalabad, most of my paternal line were killed during the Soviet-Afghan wars. So it hasn't been, we heard that the family home was taken over by someone else, and my dad just let it go. So a lot of it is letting go and not feeling like he, because we were sort of outside of Afghanistan when all of it happened, that he has a right to return in a way. So he feels a lot of that, and I think when I listen to his stories, it comes through in some of the poetry, which is, it is a way of connecting oneself. They say wherever your umbilical cord is buried is where home is, and for me it was under a lime tree in Jalalabad. So for me, I always return to that image. But it hasn't been a real trip back for me, or my family, because there's no one for us to go back to.
Yeah. It reminds me of a personal detail that, like, when I was little and I would fall asleep in the back of the car, and my dad would roll into our home in Ohio, and he would say, like, wake up, Pakistan's here, like, we're home now. And I'd be like, what? Like, so disoriented. But because your home is your country in a lot of ways, and it's interesting to hear you reflect that, both of you. And I wonder about this process of writing as remembrance, but also as a response to so much that was taken away, loss of family members, but also in a country where artistic expression and arts themselves were banned under the Taliban, right? So do you feel like your writing is also necessarily, even though it is in exile in some ways, does it feel like an act of resistance as well to that kind of continued legacy?
So for me, I cannot claim to ever feel like I experienced any of that restriction, right? Because I didn't. I had absolutely every freedom. And my writing actually comes from a place of that acute understanding of that I had every opportunity. And in the very same year that I was heading off to college, the Taliban were taking control of the country and shutting down schools for girls. So I write from my place of privilege. And I also, I'll couple that with saying that I don't feel the need to speak for that particular experience because there are so many Afghan women who are doing it. And so, what I hope to be writing in my stories is more a reflection of what the dynamics look like and of the interpersonal challenges. And could you take this particular marriage and transplant it out of Afghanistan and put it into the United States and still talk about the same interpersonal dynamics and the same resilience and the same grit, but with the backdrop just being different. So I think, it is, and this goes into another discussion that could also be a whole other day of, how easy is it to speak for, people who have gone through a very, very different experience than your own. But it takes a good amount of, I think, self-reflection and taking a look at, what is really the heart of what you're trying to write about and who are you writing for?
Well, actually, I write mostly to show the defiant Afghan spirit, even though it sounds nostalgic. It's not really I'm missing so much, but kind of making up for the one-dimensional, two-dimensional way of seeing Afghans here, the kind of savior complexes, the idea that it's just a rubble country, that it's just like only seen war, and the only history we get is like the last maybe 30, 40 years. So I want to, my work is a scholarly interrogation of like history. I mean, maybe it sounds too floral, I work on it a little more, but the idea is more that in these stories, there is always that defiance, there is always that strong spirit, there is always this, again, interconnectedness with this world that we study and then the world we don't study, right? So I'm more interested in that in my work, not necessarily, I'm not writing about, remembering a fruit that I had eaten in Jalalabad or something. That's a different genre of like diasporic writing. That's not what I'm interested in. I document the loss. I document photographs that have been destroyed, families that I've never seen my family sort of spread throughout the world at this point. And so I write more about the disconnect, but also excavating a lot of these strong females, like the Ay Khanum story, the story of Rokhshana Rabia. There's other poets. For me, I'm more interested in that mythic connection and bringing back myth and sort of these archetypal brave heroic figures that we read with the Iliad, that we read in, other texts where we think about heroes. I'm more interested in that, or the epic poems of, say, like Beowulf or Gawain and the Green Knight. I'm more interested in these stories, and the longer pieces I write are about like the building of the Kabul wall and the young girl who stands up against it. I mean, this is 8th century, right? So my interest is more in the historic and kind of plugging Afghanistan back into that in whatever way I can, right? Teaching it, and then also writing poetry about it. So that's more my work. My early nostalgic pieces, about going into the Kabul market and being like, hey, this is what my identity is. It doesn't feel as important. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw this, but the best documentary short went to a film called Learning to Skateboard in a War Zone If You're a Girl, this movie about girls in Afghanistan who find a real kind of freedom and movement of spirit in skateboarding. And I wonder how you situate those kinds of opportunities and kind of respond to that kind of work to showcase that side of things in this contemporary context. How did you feel just in that moment?
I think what people really like about seeing the image of, and if you've seen any clips, like, it's very striking, right? To see these young girls with their like headscarves like tucked under these helmets, and they're in skirts that are down to here, and yet they're like flying down these ramps, and they're in this huge like warehouse-looking building. It's surprising, and I think that's what I like to incorporate into my stories too. And I think every one of them, the feedback at least that I've had from book club discussions, is that there's something surprising. The women in the stories kind of do something that shocks the readers, because they're either braver than they thought, or they're not as, they're more racy, maybe they're more raunchy than you thought, and maybe, this teenage woman or teenage girl managed to, manipulate her father into getting what she wanted. Wait, I didn't think she could do that. Mm-hmm. I didn't think anyone could do that. Or to talk about the female leaders that we've had who have stepped up and, like the Queen. And that's why it's no accident that the Queen's in there. It's because she was somebody who I think surprised people. We all want to be surprised by stories, right? We don't want to read what we already know. We don't want to read what we already are assuming, or hopefully not. So I think the inclusion of girls, of women, of men who are doing things that we don't expect them to is one of the most delicious parts of, taking in a story and kind of having our minds blown a little bit.
Yeah. But why are we surprised when we see Afghan women doing, or Afghan men doing things? I mean, that's really the question. I think with the film that just won the Oscar, I would like to see more representations from Afghan filmmakers and Afghan artists who are doing and creating work, and not so much pitting it or portraying it as, here's this surprising thing. I mean, I would kind of ask for more inclusion of the incredible filmmakers I know about who are doing work not in this way of like, let's do it for this, and then kind of bringing, again, that savior spirit. So although I
some
like
that you think we should look out for, or some works that you think are worth checking out for that kind of angle?
I think that one is funding. There are a few young Afghan filmmakers that I like, and there's some ones I really love. Siddiqa Mujaddidi, the video art of Lida Abdul. I mean, that's not going to win an Oscar, but for art stuff, it's definitely a person to look at. Siddiqa Mujaddidi's work, Mariam Ghani's films, the work of young filmmakers who are working behind. I think you have I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm supposed to put you on the spot, but you have a film project coming up, and there's an Afghan filmmaker working on that who's Ali Baluch. So, so I think
we're on the cusp of really seeing the Afghan film industry kind of step into its own. There's now a woman who's the head of the Afghan film company in Afghanistan itself. And so I think that in the next few years, we're going to see a lot coming out of the country that's made but with Afghans, not just in front of the camera, but also behind the camera as well, directing, writing, and guiding how the story is being told and what story is being told. So it will change the narrative.
Well, I think it's been happening for the past 20 years. It's just a matter of what kind of stories do we think is marketable, or that has, Afghanistan has been kind of put into this narrow idea of how it should express itself, and Afghan artists are feeling that. So I think the idea is now making more room, and I hope all this discussion about American Dirt makes that that conversation happen, which we talked about as well. So
yeah. Well, thank you both for sharing those recommendations and for this lively, fascinating discussion about Afghanistan. Nadia is the author of A House Without Windows. Zohra is a poet, professor, and the co-editor of One Story, 30 Stories, an anthology of contemporary Afghan American literature. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Let's have a big round of applause for you both, and thanks again for joining us. Yes, thank you. I'm really working on these transitions. Yeah, it's a art. Now, yeah, not quite so poetic, right? Well, thank you for bearing with me. Now we have a really incredible guest with us who is a musician. His name is Elham Fanous. Elham is a leading Afghan pianist. I'll wait for him to come out. All right, here he is. Elham is a leading Afghan pianist of his generation. He recently became a recipient of a Young Musical Scholars Foundation, and his experiences of learning to play piano under Taliban rule are the subject of a German television documentary. Elham is also currently pursuing his master's degree here at the Manhattan School of Music, and he has a few songs that he'll share with us. A few pieces. Elham, thank you so much for that.
Thank
Can
you.
you tell us a little bit about the pieces that you just played?
Yeah, so this two different pieces that I played was by a German composer, Robert Schumann, and the piece is called Fantasy Stücke, Opus 12. And so I just played the first two songs. There are 8 different pieces, and the first one was Evening, Das Abends, and then Ausfang was the second one, which meant soaring.
Soaring.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could hear that. So can you tell us a little bit about how you started to play piano? What was your journey like to music?
So when I was 5 years old, I was into music. I was born in a open-minded and musical family back in Afghanistan in 1997. My father was a singer, and when I was 5, I played tabla, which is an Indian and Afghan classical instrument. And when I grew up at the age of around 12, my dad decided to he encouraged me to pick up an instrument like piano or violin. And then I looked up on YouTube. I was searching about these instruments, and I saw this pianist called Vladimir Horowitz, which is one of the most famous and greatest pianists of all time. And I didn't know who Vladimir Horowitz was at the time. But I just saw the piano and how prestigious it looked and how beautiful the sound is. For me, piano is an orchestra. It can do anything, play melody, rhythmic, arpeggio, harmony, everything is included in the piano. So I just fell in love with the sound of it and with the shape of the piano, and I decided to pick it up.
Yeah, but just picking it up at 12, isn't that pretty late for someone who is a classically trained musician? Was
For
it a hard?
sure, yeah, for sure. As everyone probably knows, the typical age would be around 8, maybe the latest 8, 7. Some people start at 2, 3, yeah.
Yeah, and this is, I imagine it's especially difficult for you because, I mean, the Taliban bans music in Afghanistan in 1996. You were born in 1997. So how did you make your way to going from YouTube videos to actually playing? Who supported you? How did you find your way?
Yeah, my family was always my supporters. There is just one music school in the entire country. It's called Afghanistan National Institute of Music. And 2008, it was just called Art School, which included painting, everything, music. But then a man by the name of Ahmad Sarmast, Dr. Ahmad Sarmast, he's the only musicologist from Afghanistan. And he studied in Monash University in Australia, and he founded this school, and the name changed to Afghanistan National Institute of Music. And my dad encouraged me to go to this school when I was 11 or 12, and then I went there. And the first year was like nothing. We didn't have really teacher or the pianist or anyone like piano. We were waiting in line for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes each to practice.
Yeah, because I read somewhere that there was only 25 pianos in all of Afghanistan at that time?
Around 25 pianos in the entire country, and 15 of them are in my school. So
15?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. And then there was a line even there. Wow, that's incredible. Yeah. So you were going to this school, you picked up piano. I mean, clearly you had a natural love for it. And so how did you decide that this was it for you, that this is your passion moving forward?
Yeah, for sure. I absolutely love music, and that was the easy way for me because I absolutely loved it, and I just wanted to become a musician because that was the way that I could express myself. And when I learned my favorite pieces, such as these pieces and some other pieces, my favorite composer is Chopin. When I learned those composers, some of those pieces, I absolutely fell in love, and I thought this is the way that I could express and bring people together and make a beautiful world through music. And for me, I just want to represent Afghanistan as a musical diplomat or musical personality, and travel all around the world, teach, play, perform, and show a positive face of Afghanistan.
And you were learning music in the backdrop of conflict, and I understand that it had a big impact at the Institute of Music's founder, as well as others who were involved in your work. So can you tell me a little bit about how conflict kind of interrupted or interfered with your pursuit of music?
Yeah, for sure. So in Afghanistan, as people might know, there are still actually some extremists who believe that music is not allowed or shouldn't be played. So we had a attack in 2014 at the French Cultural Center, where actually my friends, a few of my friends perform, and I was actually going there to watch the performance, but I was lucky enough to be 10 minutes late, and then when I went there, it was already attacked, and I couldn't go in. So there are conflicts like that. There are things going on people don't like. I mean, I wouldn't say they don't like music, but it's more like they just have a negative or a different idea of making music. They don't know what music truly is, because some people are not educated enough to, or they don't travel around the world to see what's going on around them. So these conflicts, they definitely affected me being a musician and be a representative of my country as a musician, and it was definitely hard for me to pursue this. And still, I mean, it's challenging in different ways, but I'm lucky to be here and studying music and pursue my dreams.
Yeah, and so you walked up and saw that this had happened. I wonder if, it made you feel like this is something that you want to pursue even more. And did you feel like do you think that there's a power in music that is the reason why it's so threatened and that people have these negative views towards it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, for me, that definitely encouraged me to pursue even more, because I think for me, I would like to challenge myself, and so I just stayed with music, and I will definitely stay, until the end of my life. But for me, it was just an expression, and like to kind of express myself, and people, as I said, they don't really have the right idea of what music can really do, what music can really be. And in my experience, I've brought many people together, and I've introduced and represented my country in different ways that people, sometimes when I introduce myself to some Americans, they think they have never met someone from Afghanistan before. So I hope someday my country would also recognize that and have a different, that's one of my ambitions, to kind of change that in my country and outside, because in my country there are different problems, that I have, like there are people who think differently, so I have to make sure to educate them about music and about what it can really be. There are different reasons, religious reasons that they think music is not allowed, or they just have different ideas of music.
So you came to the U.S. for the first time on tour with some fellow students in 2013, and you were a soloist at the New England Conservatory in Boston, the Kennedy Center, Carnegie Hall. I guess, what comes next for you, and do you see yourself going back and playing in Afghanistan at all?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I would love to go there, and I hope to have a performing arts center someday in Afghanistan, and my own music school, not just in Afghanistan, but all around the world. But for me, the next step would be, I'm looking forward to work with my teacher here at Manhattan School of Music, Professor Philip Kamen, who's actually present here, and that made me a little nervous.
Oh.
But
How do you do?
I look forward. I look forward to work with him and develop my technique, my sound as a musician, the technical aspects of being a musician. And then the next, for me, I want to teach, I want to perform, I want to enter a few competitions in the future just represent my country and hopefully be a musical diplomat.
Yeah, well, we wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So thank you again so much for joining us, for sharing your music and your story. You're going to play one more piece for us, right? Can you tell us a little bit? Can you tell us a little bit more about this piece?
Yeah, for sure. So this is going to be an Afghan song that since there are Afghans talking and we are talking about Afghanistan, traveling to Afghanistan. So I'm going to be playing an Afghan song by a singer called his name is Wahid Sabri. And this is actually one of my favorite songs, and I have arranged it for piano, and I kind of improvise on the theme of the song, and hope you like it, enjoy it.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Let's hear it one more time for Elham Fanous.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And let's keep the appreciation going for all of our guests tonight, Nadia Hashimi and Zohra Saed. And thank you to everyone at the Green Space who worked so hard to make this night's event possible, especially tonight's producer, Blakeney Schick. And thank you all so much for coming to celebrate the art, the culture, and the spirit of Afghanistan. We'd like to now announce our raffle, and I'll have Elham help me. Can you pick out a name? I don't know how well I can mix them up, but...
Ramin.
Do we have a Ramin? All right. Okay, you can meet me outside afterward, and everyone else, please stick around. Our guests will be in the lobby for you to chat with. You can check out the Afghanistan box, and we also have our Rwanda box on sale outside. But thank you all so much for joining. Our next event is on May 5th, and the country is to be announced. But if you sign up, I can keep you informed on what country comes next. But thank you all so much for joining in this event. It's been a real pleasure to have you.